Thank you for tuning in. Today we're going to be covering Federalist number 37. It's titled Concerning the Difficulties of the Convention in Devising a Proper Form of Government. This one, it says it's written by Alexander Hamilton, but I'm pretty sure, maybe I'm wrong. I think this is supposed to be a Madison paper. Federalist number 37. That's weird because I have it written like it's a Madison paper, but on the site where I find who writes them, usually here it says Hamilton, but it's supposed to be. I can actually tell, to be honest with you all, it seems like it's Madison just because the wording is different. You can tell the way when you read so many pieces from the same writer over and over again, and then it changes to a different writer. James Madison is much more eloquent in the way in which he characterizes things, I think, than Hamilton is, but Hamilton seems to actually be a little bit more straightforward than Madison. He doesn't use as broad of language, and he doesn't use the big words really as much as James Madison does. So yeah, from what I see online here, it's looking like it's a Madison one, which is weird. So, but to continue here, it was written on January 11th, 1788. Topics include papers are to determine the object of the Constitution, government representatives should be dependent on the people, and three branches has never been done successfully until now. So this one's just a generic opening. I think it's important. There's certain important quotes. This is the generic opening of what the government is going to be like, where they kind of lay out the organizational structure of the government, and then after that they go through the individual branches. But that's after Federalist number 51. We're going to be dealing with this now for the next maybe around 15 papers from 37 to 51. So Madison, he opens up this paper with the sole mission of the papers. He states, and I quote, "The ultimate object of these papers is to determine clearly and fully the merits of the Constitution," end quote. So this is really, it's pretty self-explanatory. The point of these papers is to explain it to everybody, figure out the merits, see how legitimate it is to the people, what the people think about it as well. This paper is another one of the more significant ones in terms of the balance of power in the government, as well as the purpose of our Constitution. So Madison next, he characterizes the structures of the convention. He states, and I quote, "It is a misfortune inseparable from human affairs that public measures are rarely investigated with that spirit of moderation which is essential to a just estimate of their real tendency to advance or obstruct the public good, and that spirit is more apt to be diminished than promoted by those occasions which require an unusual exercise of it." So what he's saying is the measures that are rarely investigated, having to do with the spirit of the moderation. So what he's saying is these people that are his dissenters here, their spirit of, I guess, jealousy or their mean-spirited actions are not going to be investigated for the real reasoning behind, the real intent behind their actions and their feelings. And the spirit is more apt to be diminished and promoted by those occasions which require an unusual exercise of it. So when they go out there and they bring out this unusual, it's almost like when the boy, he's saying these people are over-exaggerating to the point where what they're doing is becoming meaningless and trivial. And it's almost like the boy that cried wolf, really, is what he's trying to characterize. So then he goes on, he states, and I quote, "In some it has been too evident from their own publications that they have scanned the proposed Constitution not only with a predisposition to censure, but with a predetermination to condemn, as the language held by others betrays an opposite predetermination or bias, which must render their opinions also of little moment in the question," end quote. So this is actually very, very relative to what's going on today. You have people that want to change the Constitution, or they want to scrap it and get a whole new governing document. If you scrap the Constitution, it's not even, at this point, it's not even possible to really scrap a Constitution. If you did, then there would just be tumult all across the country. you would have states that would be unwilling to join back into the Union to begin with. So scrapping the Constitution is just it's an ignorant proposition. It's just not possible to do so. It's not realistic. A lot of them people want it amended, and these are all people, and this is why it's relative. These are all people that have probably never even read the Constitution before. If anything, at the most, they skimmed through it, just like Madison is characterizing all the objectors of the convention and the proposed Constitution. They're people that have never even read it. They maybe skimmed through it, and they already had their own predeterminations to condemn it because they didn't like it, just like people now that complain about Constitution in general are not of the right wing. It's all people of the left wing that want to fundamentally change the way the government works and the country, which is why they already have their predetermination, and that's why they don't even read it, because they just disagree with everything having to do with any root fundamental values of America. So Madison remarks that objectors are acting on their own bias and predetermined condemnation. Now, this paper is not meant for those dissenters, but rather, and I quote, this is what Madison says, those only who add to a sincere zeal for the happiness of their country, a temper favorable to a just estimate of the means of promoting it, end quote. So he said these papers, we're not going to change the psyche or the feelings of our dissenters, but this is more for people that are either even-tempered, either in the middle, or people that are that have a sincere enthusiasm for the happiness of their country, and they want to promote that happiness. So Madison asserts next, he states, and I quote, persons of this character will proceed to an examination of the plan submitted by the convention, not only without a disposition to find or to magnify faults, but will see the propriety of reflecting that a faultless plan was not to be expected, nor will they barely make allowances for the errors which may be chargeable on the fallibility to which the convention as a body of men were liable, but will keep in mind that they themselves are also are but men, and ought not to assume an infallibility in rejudging the fallible opinions of others, end quote. So he uses the word fallible a lot. He's really just saying that you're going to have men that they look at this document, this governing document, and the plan, and they will be objective in looking at it. And they're not going to go out there looking to magnify the faults, but they will point them out. And it is also to be expected that the Constitution is not going to be a perfect document, because man in themselves is not perfect, so they're not going to be able to make a perfect document, and the men reading will be able to discern that. Now, they will not be sitting there making allowances for errors, but rather they want to fix and rectify those problems. And that's all he's saying, instead of just completely throwing away the document in its entirety like the objectors would have done, and like a lot of the left wing wants to do now. Madison highlights that the Constitution will replace the current Articles of Confederation, which he characterized as fallacious. So he goes on. He states, and I quote, it has been shown in the course of these papers that the existing Confederation is founded on principles which are fallacious, that we must consequently change this first foundation, and with it the superstructure resting upon it. It has been shown that the other confederacies which could be consulted as precedents have been vitiated by the same erroneous principles, and can therefore furnish no other light than that of beacons which give warning of the course to be shunned without pointing out that which ought to be pursued, end quote. So here what he's alluding to is he's saying Hamilton and all the prior papers, we've gone through the history of all these different countries in Europe, all these other republics and all these other confederations, and we've seen all their own erroneous principles, and those erroneous principles are currently in the governing document of the Articles of Confederation, and they should serve as beacons of light and just as a resource for us to see what the future could look like if we continue down the path of the Articles of Confederation with all of these fallacious principles. So Madison outlines the need for the power to correct errors in the Constitution he cites, And I quote, "Among the difficulties encountered by the convention, a very important one must have lain in combining the requisite stability and energy in government with the invaluable attention due to liberty and to the Republican form." So yeah, he's just saying we want to be able to, in this convention, in the proposed constitution, he's referring that we're going to need stability and energy. Those are the two most important factors in the union's government. So in the federal government, those are the most important factors. And then also you want to have a due attention to the liberty and to the Republican form of government, where a Republican form of government is the republic. You have representatives. It's a representative republic, or it's democratically elected representatives, but they call it a constitutional republic, and a republic meaning that you are represented by individuals and they are loyal to you and your interests, and you're considered their constituents. So in other words, the latter part of this excerpt stresses the balance needed in the form of government proposed that will protect the people but will not infringe on the liberty of the citizens. And that's a very important value of Republican government. So Madison asserts, and I quote, "Energy in government is essential to that security against external and internal danger, and to that prompt and salutary execution of the laws which enter into the very definition of good government," end quote. So the most important part of government is to be able to secure people from external and internal danger. External meaning other countries, and then internal meaning from within, people that want to steal your property, kill you, take your life away from you, your life, liberty, and your property away from you, essentially. And that's what government's there to protect. So it goes on here, and this is an important quote. I have it marked with some stars. I'll explain it afterwards. He states, and I quote, "Stability in government is essential to national character and to advantages annexed to it, as well as to the repose and confidence in the minds of the people, which are among the chief blessings of civil society, and irregular and mutable legislation is not more an evil in itself than it is odious to the people, and it may be pronounced with assurance that the people of this country, enlightened as they are with regard to the nature, and interested as the great body of them are in the effects of government, will never be satisfied till some remedy to be applied to the vicissitudes and uncertainties which characterized the state administrations," end quote. So at this time, the state administrations were very volatile. They were changing frequently their laws, which caused an instability. And that's why I said, what did I say? I said energy and stability were the two big ones. Stability, as in what Madison's characterizing here. He's talking about we cannot have mutable change. We can't have a government that is consistently changing all of the time, because that causes instability in our system. That's an evil in itself, then it is odious to the people with irregular, immutable legislation. And he's absolutely right about this, which is why I actually like the idea of Ted Cruz being able to put term limits on people that are in the Congress. Now, what we're currently doing in our system is every single time we have somebody be appointed or elected as the new president, that person walks in. Currently, I don't even know how many executive orders Joe Biden has. It's been about a week, and I know it's well over 30. We have the executive branch come in, the president, and pass a bunch of executive order mandates that really are not legislation. They're not real law. They're just mandates. They don't really mean much, actually. They don't hold much power or water. They shouldn't. People should honestly treat them like garbage, just throw them away and not really care for them. But that's what we have currently going on in the system, and that's an unstable system, because every single time, every 4 years, it really becomes a consequential election every time, because we have vested too much power in the federal government, and in the federal head in particular has been vested with too much power, the executive branch, and that was because our legislative branch has been a joke, and they have delegated the powers that they are accountable for and they are responsible for to the executive branch, and that's why we're having all these issues. That's why the presidential election is so big every 4 years, and everyone cares about politics so much, is because the government actually really does have such a heavy influence in our lives, the government as well as big corporations. And right now we're going through, as I'm recording this is I have the whole Robin Hood thing going on. There's a class action lawsuit I just read a couple minutes ago. I mean, it is a total disaster nightmare, because we had people trading on GameStop stock that was shorted by a bunch of hedge funders. Hedge funders literally lost all of their money because a bunch of people that were on Reddit went and they bought the stock up. Long story short, the guys that shorted it had to buy it back, driving the stock up even higher. And we have a lot of people that are pretty much bankrupt. Some agencies or some investment firms that are, from what I understand, reports are saying they're bankrupt. Which isn't. Here's the thing. This to me, we have that happen with the hedge funds. Do that themselves. They go on TV. They sell a product, and then people go and they buy the stock. So these people organizing themselves to buy the stock, I don't really see much harm in what they're doing. It's kind of the name of the game, because it's like, if Wall Street, if you guys want to play by that rule, then you're also going to have to play by, when you make money, then you're going to have to also lose money, because the same rule applies to other citizens as well, if that's the rules you guys want to play by at this point. But the problem is the government overreach now, and the big corporation overreach is now. Robinhood, the app, shut down trading of certain stocks. You can only sell it, you can't even buy it. So that's what they're doing right now. And apparently I've seen I don't even know if this is true, if it's an edited photo, but I've seen photos saying that Robinhood is selling people stocks for them, which I don't even know if that's actually legal for them to do. So to have this capricious and irregular form of government it causes great instability, and that's, I think, part of the reason why they call it. I don't really like to even use the word divisive, because it's so overused, but it's so overused that at this point it's redundant to use it. But that's the best way to explain it, is that's why we are so divisive, and that's why there's such a big fight over who the president is every 4 years, because they actually enact and instill policy. They do the job that the legislative branch is supposed to be doing. So Madison calls stability in government an essential characteristic in a civil society. He states, and I quote, "The genius of Republican liberty seems to demand on one side not only that all power should be derived from the people, but that those entrusted with it should be kept in independence on the people by a short duration of their appointments, and that even during this short period, these trusts should be placed not in a few, but a number of hands," end quote. So essentially, if you have the power in a number of hands, then what you're going to have is you're going to create a stability, safeguards, because you would have to, for all of your rights to get taken away from you, you would have to think at least 50% of all of those hands have to be complicit in what's going on. It really wouldn't even be 50%. It'd have to be something like 75%, because you would need constitutional amendments to take away rights. Does this actually relate to today, where people think that they are responsible to their constituency? I'm not really sure. I think it's also because the mainstream media, they're supposed to also be a safeguard and a check on our Congress members and our government officials, and they have failed to do so. They lick the boots of the Democrat Party. So this does not relate as much to today, because they do not feel like they are responsible to their constituency at all. They kind of just pass whatever they feel like passing, and then the media covers for them and puts on the big smoke screen and makes a story out of somebody hitting somebody else over the head with a twisted tea can, instead of actually reporting the legislative decisions of our Congress. So Madison continues to characterize a stable government. He states, and I quote, "Stability, on the contrary, requires that the hands in which power is lodged should continue for a length of time the same. A frequent change of men will result from a frequent return of elections, and a frequent change of measures from a frequent change of men, whilst energy in government requires not only a certain duration of power, but the execution of it by a single hand, end quote. So these are all things that they were thinking about when they were constructing the Constitution, was how long are these terms going to be for House of Rep members, how long are the terms going to be for senators, how long is the term going to be for the president. So these are all things that they had to bring into, they had to think about before instilling the policy and writing it all down on paper. So they decided, obviously, on what they were going to do. They think it provided stability as well as energy, because you do need to have a decent amount of time in the government to be able to have that, I guess you would call it, the energy. The House of Representatives, at first, what they were saying is they would have 1-year terms, and then they went up to 2-year terms. And I don't remember exactly for the senators. I know the senators are 6-year terms, but I don't remember what the initial proposition was. And then, as you know, president is a 4-year term. So additionally, the proportionality and balance of authority between the general government and state governments is another important element of a stable government in which the Constitution is to achieve. Madison asserts, and I quote, "Experience has instructed us that no skill in the science of government has yet been able to discriminate and define with sufficient certainty its 3 great provinces, the legislative, executive, and judiciary, or even the privileges and powers of the different legislative branches. Questions daily occur in the course of practice which prove the obscurity which reigns in these subjects and which puzzle the greatest adepts in political science," end quote. So he's pretty much saying this is a government that's never been done before. It has never successfully been done because it's never been successfully laid out to discriminate and define sufficiently the legislative branch, the executive, and the judiciary. And that's what they're trying to do in this proposed Constitution. This is really just, I guess you would call it, the opening to what these papers are for and what the Constitution is going to be all about, this paper in general. So he goes on, and I quote, "The experience of ages with the continued and combined labors of the most enlightened legislatures and jurists has been equally unsuccessful in delineating the several objects and limits of different codes and of laws and different tribunals of justice, the precise extent of the common law and the statute law, the maritime law, the ecclesiastical law, the law of corporations, and other local laws and customs remain still to be clearly and finally established in Great Britain, where accuracy in such subjects has been more industriously pursued than in any other part of the world," end quote. So, what he's saying here, this form of government to define all 3 of the branches successfully and to be able to discern between the different codes of law as it relates to whether it's common law, statute law, maritime law, whatever. I don't even know what the ecclesiastical law is, the law of corporations, local laws, and customs. This has never even been successfully established, clearly defined, not even in Great Britain. And at this time, Great Britain was probably the furthest in advancement of government of this format. So that's why, that's the importance of the proposed Constitution, and that's why the Constitution, the writing of the Constitution, is such an historical event for not only this country but also mankind, because it's something that has never been successfully done before. So this is meaning that the form of the proposed government has never been executed before. Madison details that the tasks of defining these ideas and provisions is difficult, and which he says before, but it's also difficult because of the way in which you use words to express ideas, because the way that sometimes things are worded, they can be confounded in other ways. So he goes on, he states, and I quote, "The use of words is to express ideas perspicuity, therefore requires not only that the ideas should be distinctly formed, but that they should be expressed by words distinctly and exclusively appropriate to them. But no language is so copious as to supply words and phrases for every complex idea, or so correct as not to include many equivocally denoting different ideas," end quote. So just to begin with, the English language is actually probably the furthest advanced than any other language in the entire world. You have so many different synonyms for different meanings. Some words are variations of others. So it is difficult, especially in the English language, to be able to differentiate between one and the other in terms of the way in which you word things in the Constitution. He's just saying it's highly important that we use the right words to explain. It's almost like it's a comparison to this show. It's like when I come out here, I really do try to put it in the most consumable format to best explain it to the viewer and the listener. And that's all he's saying here. So he continues on this. He states, and I quote, "Hence it must happen that however accurately objects may be discriminated in themselves, and however accurately the discrimination may be considered, the definition of them may be rendered inaccurate by the inaccuracy of the terms in which it is delivered, and this unavoidable inaccuracy must be greater or less according to the complexity and novelty of the objects defined. When the Almighty himself condescends to address mankind in their own language, his meaning, luminous as it must be, is rendered dim and doubtful by the cloudy medium through which it is communicated." End quote. So this is an epic quote here. What he's saying at the very end, it's awesome. So what he says in the very beginning is that you can have an outlook, you can have something that you think may be accurately discriminated or accurately explained, but the terms that you use to explain it may be rendered inaccurate and defined completely differently from the way that you define them yourself, which that will pretty much throw away the entire provision or the entire law, whatever you were writing. It's like today when people like to look through different amendments and they say, oh, we thought that they meant this with this amendment. Oh, they thought they meant that. It's essentially that idea that some people conceive things differently or comprehend things differently. And then at the very end, he writes, well, look at it here. He goes, the Almighty, he goes, God himself, when he condescends on men and speaks to them in their own language, his meaning, luminous, bright, strong, as it must be, and as clear as it must be, it is somehow rendered dim and doubtful by the cloudy medium through which it is communicated. So the person that is communicating, I guess maybe at this time, maybe it was a priest, I don't exactly know, but God's word, look at the Almighty God, his word is even rendered dim and doubtful. Even his words are misconceived. So if his words and his communication could be misconceived, then the Constitution, I guess, we have to make sure we personally also use the right words. And that's all he's saying there. I think it's it might be a rip on maybe the church. I don't really know. But it's a very good point that he makes. Because even now you have, how many different versions of Christianity do you have? You have some issues with the Catholic Church. And then the Lutherans believe in some different things in the Catholic Church because Martin Luther called them out with, I think it was something like the 99 Theses or something like that. I don't remember exactly. It's all history. So he continues, and I quote, "To the difficulties already mentioned may be added the interfering pretensions of the larger and smaller states. We cannot err in supposing that the former would contend for the participation in the government fully proportioned to their superior wealth and importance, and that the latter would not be less tenacious of the equality at present enjoyed by them. We may well suppose that neither side would entirely yield to the other, and consequently that the struggle could be terminated only by compromise." End quote. He's saying there's certain states that are going to try to have more power than others. The larger states in general might have more power than the smaller states, and the smaller states are not going to give in. They will not genuflect upon them. They won't just give in to the larger states, and they're going to fight. And we need to figure out a government system where all of them are represented as equally as we can make it. And this needs to be terminated. This struggle can only be terminated by a compromise. And it's a good explanation because then they end up having the House of Representatives that's more based on population, and the senators, which are 2 to every state, so it's not based on population at all. So it does give some powers and props up the smaller states. Now he goes on, and I quote, "It is extremely probable also that after the ratio of representation had been adjusted, this very compromise must have produced a fresh struggle between the same parties to give such a turn to the organization of the government and to the distribution of its power as would increase the importance of the branches in forming which they had respectively obtained the greatest share of influence, end quote. So that's what he's saying. As one gets bigger than the other, and there's a struggle between power, that's why it's important to have all three branches, because the three branches can be a safeguard on one state trying to overpower another state. And even the government trying to overpower, let's say the legislative branch wants to somehow put restrictions on New Jersey, who has a lower population than New York, then you also have the judicial branch that's not going to allow that to happen because that's against the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protections Clause. Madison, next, he characterizes the Constitutional Convention, and this is where we're getting to the end here, and this is probably some of the most profound stuff from this paper. He states, and I quote, "The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with a unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on this circumstance without partaking of the astonishment. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it a finger of that almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the revolution," end quote. So what he's saying is it's a real wonder. So many difficulties should have been surmounted, and they're surmounted with a unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. So he's saying all of these issues we've had the revolution, we went through, 10 years without the Constitution. We still survived. There was all these issues. And now we have the Constitution. He's pretty much saying, because there wasn't actually a unanimous vote on the Constitution in the convention. There was people that dissented to it. But he's not referring to that here. He is subliminally actually referring to the revolution and the founding of the country. The founding of the country beginning with, people coming here in the 1492 Columbus, probably. He's probably referring to that. And he's referring also probably to the Mayflower Compact. And then I forgot that guy's name. I think his name's Thomas Bradford or William Bradford, something like that. And then them going through the revolution, and then all the history of America, everything that has taken place so far, he feels like there's been a unanimity in terms of the success, as in God has bestowed upon them success at every single turn of the way, no matter what. The almighty hand of God has always extended their relief in the most critical stages of the existence of the United States. And that's really, and he said, as it must have been unexpected, like no one was expecting this, and almost like the country was created as an act of God, which actually comports with the very first Thanksgiving address from George Washington. That's when I think Thanksgiving was officially first recognized in the United States, was right after George Washington became the president, and right after he was elected. He went out and gave a speech, and that's why it's weird when we talk about Thanksgiving and everyone's like, oh, well, Thanksgiving is all about the Pilgrims. It really isn't about any of that. What it's really about is thanking God for the existence of America, because the year before, and even before that, with William Bradford, his whole Thanksgiving address too, the same thing. It was actually him thanking God for their survival of getting through the winter. And then it had nothing to do with meeting with Native Americans or killing Native Americans. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. Thanksgiving for them was actually like eating dinner, because at that time, the way that the religion worked, I think they were Puritans, I'm pretty sure, William Bradford and his crew. They had this thing called the Mayflower Compact. To make a long story short, they ran it like a commune. It did not work. So what they did instead is they gave everyone a plot of land and made it much more of a free market structure instead, where everybody is kind of responsible for themselves, and then they found great success in the winter, and they lived through it, and then they had Thanksgiving to commend God and to thank God for everything that were given to them, the success. And usually the way that specific subsect of culture or religion worked is they didn't have this giant feast to commemorate God. What they did was probably a day of prayer. So it's just not true. The idea of what Thanksgiving is really is not true. It's not true in the way of, oh well, they killed and we're all happy that they killed Native Americans. It's not actually how it worked. There was a lot of natives that were very friendly to the Puritans when they got here, and then there was a lot of natives that were cannibals as well, and they fought each other off. It's a long story. I don't really want to get into it, but specifically, George Washington's address, his Thanksgiving address, was about thanking God for them being able to get through the Revolution. They were a country for 10 years, and then the proposal of the Constitution, having this set government, that's really what the Thanksgiving address was. If you ever have any questions about it, I think maybe one of these days I'll go over it, but you can look it up, George Washington's Thanksgiving address, and there's really nothing in there about what you would think Thanksgiving is. So next he goes on. Madison, he concludes this paper, this is the very last quote, with the remarkability of the approval of the proposed Constitution. He states that this was, and I quote, the first is that the convention must have enjoyed in a very singular degree an exemption from the pestilential influence of party animosities, the disease most incident to deliberative bodies and most apt to contaminate their proceedings. The second conclusion is that all the deputations composing the convention were satisfactorily accommodated by the final act, or were inducted or induced to accede to it by a deep conviction of the necessity of sacrificing private opinions and partial interests to the public good, and by a despair of seeing this necessity diminished by delays or by new experiments, end quote. So here what he's just saying is we had a convention that there was an exemption of the pestilence influence. So party animosities were not there in this proposal, in this convention, and that is another act of God really that they're looking at here, is that people actually tried to work together, and then when the vote came up, it got approved. Not everybody approved of it, but the deliberations were legitimate from what he's saying here, and it was people actually trying to work for the betterment of their fellow man as well as their country. That's all he's really saying. So, in other words, just to try to put it in simpler terms, men, to Madison's amazement, have put party and personal opinions aside and came together to approve a constitution for the betterment of man. So that concludes this one. I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe, drop the mic, let people know about the podcast, and I will see you next time on Wednesday. Thank you.